listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Happy Tuesday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. Welcome to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over, see all the goodness that's Odyssey Radio, and at the same time, come on over to my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts, and you'll see the video simulcast of this program, as well as join the live chat room inhabited by live Intrepids. So come on over and enjoy the chat room, enjoy the video, and you can also, while there, you can check out the almost 300 videos that we have that are these shows archived in video format. So come on over, take a peek, and enjoy yourself. I want to pick up tonight. Well, first of all, I want to talk about something, but I'm not gonna in any detail. We might hit this tomorrow, but there was several news outlets are carrying the article that this whole Project 1619 thing that came out by, it was New York Times writer, and there was a Pulitzer awarded. It's about restating, reshaping, revisionist history of the United States, saying that America was really founded in 1619, and it coincided with the beginning of the American slave trade. Now, that has been quietly all revamped by the New York Times because they had been writing revisionist history, and fact checkers have pulled this apart, despite the fact that they've started teaching Project 1619 since it was written last August in 2019 in public schools. And there's a lot of people kicking back against this, saying, you know, it's all right to talk about our country's blemishes, but damn it, you better damn well have your historical facts straight. And I've been in discussions with people online and social media about Project 1619 before. There is a lot of erroneous information. Now the person who wrote it is backing off as well and say, well, that's not what I really meant when I wrote that. And so there's a lot of revisions to the revisionist history. And part of this Project 1619 was the animus behind President Trump wanting to launch the 1776 educational initiative. I can't remember exactly what he called it, but 1776 was in it, about saying, yeah, let's teach history, but let's be a little more patriotic, and at the same time, let's be a little more factual. And so we'll talk about this maybe on tomorrow's show or the next day. Let's see, I want to get my ducks in a row on it and get all my facts straight on it before I go preaching about it or talking about it. So look into that. You can look up articles on that about Project 1619 being now revised. Even though, you know, it'll tell you something. Just because it wins a Pulitzer doesn't mean it's spot on. It still has problems. So we'll talk about that later. That's hot on the tip of my tongue and in my head today, but I want to save that for another day. Now, we want to finish up on Senenmut, and then I hope to start talking about, in the same vein, we're talking about the Exodus. We started with talking about how the miracles of Exodus in the biblical account reflect the magics of ancient Egypt, the Hekar and the Hekhar. And how almost everything Moses did shows and reveals Egyptian magical tradition, spiritual tradition. And so we started talking about that, and then we kind of segued over into who was Moses. And Moses, I believe, was Senenmut. Of course, this guy back here, this bust, I've referred to over my shoulder. I've referred to him many times in many things we've talked about on this show. And we've talked about Senenmut in the past. But I wanted to try to get a little more detail, a little more meat on the bones over the last couple of days. And so we're going to hit him again today. But I want to take this history of Israel, the Hebrews in Egypt, and go back a step. Something I've talked about before, but we're going to put, again, more meat on the bones, maybe for a couple of days here, is the story of Joseph. And as I've said it rather tongue-in-cheek before, you know, Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. You remember the story of Joseph. where he was his father's favorite, and he had 12 older brothers. And these 12 brothers were very jealous of the favor that their father, Jacob, who was also known as Israel, these 12 sons of Israel, who actually their names stood for the 12 tribes that would come forth out of their family branches, the 12 tribes of Israel, and how they were jealous over their brother because their father treated him very specially, gave him the coat of many colors. And I can show you what that was and what that meant by standards of the day. And how he was, his brothers sold him into slavery and lied to their father and said that he had died being attacked by a wild animal and that they found his bloody clothes. And so Joseph is gone for 20 years, but he's sold into slavery. He ends up in Egypt, where he starts interpreting dreams from prison. According to the biblical account, this was a gift given to him by God to elevate him to status. And so he's relying on the Egyptian magics even then. He's interpreting dreams. And that gets to the Pharaoh's house. And he starts interpreting dreams that are disturbing the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh raises Joseph to great power. And now we'll talk about that after we finish up Senenmut here. There's a lot of details about this rise to power of Joseph under the Pharaoh, where it happened in Egypt, what time period it is most probably almost beyond a shadow of a doubt to have taken place, the city where Joseph lived and built his palace, as this high official he's raised to be the Grand Vizier. And so you see Grand Viziers and these leaders of Israel, Joseph, Moses, and so we're going to get into that. But let's finish up with Senenmut first. It's an exciting story, this story of Joseph. And there is some exciting archaeology that backs up. There's not inscription saying this is Joseph of the Old Testament. It doesn't even use the name that the Egyptian name in the Old Testament that said it was given to him, Zaphnath-Paneah. That's not used in archaeology, but there are archaeological things we have to look at that really establish who Joseph was and when he would have existed and why it makes so much sense. So, we'll get to that. Let's finish off on Senenmut first. We've been talking about Senenmut yesterday. Senenmut being the biblical Moses. We talked about how Hatshepsut was more than likely, and I want to say 100% positively, but we don't know. Everything looks right, and you have to fit in some conjecture and some speculative history, but the history works. The history timeline works that Hatshepsut would have been the Pharaoh's daughter, as the biblical story calls her. Pharaoh's daughter was bathing in a pool at the palace off the main canal that was dug by the pharaohs, and she sees the basket in the reeds and adopts Moses. She finds the baby, but his older sister, Miriam, had followed the basket to make sure she knew where it landed, and I think they were targeting the princess in Egypt. And what does Moses' sister Miriam do? She runs up and says, I know the baby's mother. I can take him from you and have him weaned. And so the princess, the Pharaoh's daughter, turns the baby back over and says, bring him back to me once he's weaned, and then when she is old enough to claim him. And this is what happens. This is the presumptive, because the story skips ahead in the Bible all the way to when Moses is 40. And he's already raised as a prince in Egypt. He kills the Egyptian, he runs off, and so on. And they never mention the Pharaoh's daughter again. Now, Pharaoh's daughter was the title, as we found out, Hatshepsut. Her name was Matkare. And she would have been the young 7 to 10-year-old girl, the princess, the Pharaoh's daughter, who would have found Moses in the Nile. And when she became the co-regent with her stepson many years later, she changed her name to her regnal name, Hatshepsut. And she was the female pharaoh. And remember, some people asked yesterday why she got the beard. That was the fake beard that the pharaohs would wear. And she wore that. She dressed in men's clothing. She was establishing that I am not a queen. I am the Pharaoh. I am the goddamn king of Egypt. That's what she established. And she did this not because she was a cross-dresser or transgender or anything like that, as some people have speculated. She did this to show that I am the king. I wear the king's clothes. I might be a woman, but you will respect me as the king. And she took on the man's role as king. And so this is the remarkable woman that I believe found Moses in the Nile, brought him into the palace, renamed him Senenmut. Senenmut meaning, and we've talked about this before, but let's recap it. The meaning of the name is mother's brother. In essence, she named him saying, I, your mother, have now elevated you to status of brother alongside me with the gods. And so she elevated him to that status. Now, it's also historically pretty well established that Senenmut was the lover of the queen, the king, the pharaoh, the queen, Hatshepsut. And there's a lot of evidence. We went through some of that yesterday. We talked about what happened to Hatshepsut's memory after her death. Didn't happen immediately, because remember, she was a co-regent with her stepson. Hatshepsut's husband, Thutmose II, her brother, both of them the children of Thutmose I, her father, Thutmose II's father. Well, they wed the brother and sister to keep the royal line strong, and they had 2 children together. They were both princesses that both died. And then she didn't have any other children with her brother, the pharaoh, and he dies at around age in his late 20s. Well, his son by a lesser wife, a harem wife, is Thutmose III. He becomes the rightful pharaoh, but he's only about 3 years old. So Hatshepsut is named as his co-regent. And she rules, and within a couple of years, she moves him up to the palaces at Mennefer, Memphis, up the Nile Delta, mouth of the Nile Delta, up in the north. And she rules as pharaoh, and rules for 22 years. And by the time she dies, Thutmose III takes over. He's about 25 to 28 years old, in that range. And they say that it was he that eradicated all of Hatshepsut's images off of all her temples, destroys all her statues, buries them in pits. But we find that this happened later in his reign. If he took the throne at 25, he rules for about 40 more years. And as he gets older, 65 to 70, in that range, he's getting old, he's getting a little sickly. He becomes co-regent with his son, his young son, Amenhotep II, who is 18 when he becomes co-regent. His father dies a couple of years later, and he is the pharaoh of the land. And it's Amenhotep II, I believe, that was the pharaoh of the Exodus. Because remember, going back a little bit, when Senenmut comes to power, if this is Moses indeed, around his age of 40, Senenmut disappears off the Egyptian scene. But he was so important to Egypt, and he was such a royal character, yet there's no mention of whatever happened to him. And both of his tombs are left unfinished. And he's not found in either one of those tombs, which is not by itself an odd thing. Many tomb raiders over the years, the centuries, have taken mummies out and they throw them down a pit in another tomb or something like that. You find whole stashes of royal mummies together in one pit because they take the bodies out, and while they're thieving the tombs. And so, but he has never turned up. I don't think they've ever found him. Now, if he is indeed Moses, they'll never find him because he didn't die there. And he left. But when he came back, according to the biblical story, Moses murdered the Egyptian and fled for his life. And he's gone for 40 years and then comes back to Egypt. Now, all these 40s and 40s and so on, these are all magical numbers. They're rounded numbers. It could have been 37 years. It could have been 42 years. Whatever it might be. The story gives it to us in these rounded numbers. Even when it says that when Solomon in the 900s built his temple, started the Temple of Jerusalem, it said on the day he dedicated the temple, it was the 480th year since the Hebrews came out of Egypt and the Exodus under Moses. 480 years, again, a very round number, divisive by 4, by 40. And so that's 40, 12 times. And what happens when you have 12? What's 12? 12 is the number of the sons, the tribes of Israel. So 12 times 40 gives you 480 years. It's a rounded number. Does that mean it was exactly 480 years? No. But if you do your math, you end up with the mid 1445, 46 BC as the date of the Exodus. And this is about the same time that Amenhotep II, the son of Tutmosis III, who was the co-regent when he was a young boy with his mother Hatshepsut, whose father was Tutmosis I, whose grandfather was Tutmosis I. First, second, and third, I mean. And this is, if Moses Senenmut returned to Egypt roughly 40 years after he fled, this would have been during the early years of the reign of Amenhotep II. And so there he is. And what happens? Well, and I believe he was recognized, Senenmut. Moses, they knew who this guy was when he came back. People still recognized him. He used the hekah, the royal scepter that God had given him. He used the hekah, the magics of Egypt. And people recognized him for who he was, who he had been in Egypt. And I believe because he led the slaves out and he wrought such destruction on the land of Egypt, that Pharaoh Amenhotep II, the son of Tutmosis III, he is the one who wiped out every image of Hatshepsut, the Pharaoh who raised him to power in the first place, the female Pharaoh who had a love affair established with Senenmut, Senenmut who fled Egypt, and she died. I believe those events were coincided as well. And so what does he do? Amenhotep II, he eradicates every image of Hatshepsut, and at the same time eradicates the history and the knowledge of Senenmut. And he buries his statues in the ground, remember? And they found 26 statues of Senenmut. And they found a pit with I think these different pits carried all 26 statues of him buried in the ground. And 9 of them showing Senenmut in this embrace with the young princess Neferuri, the daughter of Hatshepsut, and supposedly Tutmosis II, her brother, husband. Now the question I asked yesterday, is it possible that Senenmut was the father of Neferuri, when you see all the loving embrace? And he is not royal by blood, but he's been given all the titles to be royal, to show that loving embrace, to do all the things that he did, all the honors given Senenmut. He was treated as a royal. This was Hatshepsut's doing. She elevated him to status and made sure he was being considered as a royal, maybe grooming him to be the next pharaoh, even though there was only about 7 to 10 years difference between them. So this is the story we have in front of us now. And you have to ask, who was Senenmut? What do we know about him? We started this yesterday. We established the statues. One of the first things to confront us when looking at the records of Senenmut are the many beautiful statues of him as a young lad holding Hatshepsut's elder daughter, the Princess Neferuri. And we went through all these statues. He was said to be the tutor to Neferuri, and remember, I've said this before, tutors back then to the royal children were not school marms. Tutors were usually somebody who were very well known in the nation. They were nobility. They were generally former military commanders and generals, many times. And these are the people they put in as tutors to the young children of the Pharaoh. And I just went through some records yesterday, and I don't have them for this show because it was deep reading about Senenmut. But there is a lot of history about the history of Senenmut being quite the military figure in Egypt, as well as being a royal, being a nobility. And so this is also breaking protocol. If you see Senenmut as somebody who is tutoring the child, another thing is that a non-royal is not allowed to tutor or even touch a royal child. And here you have all these statues of Senenmut embracing her, holding her close. And so this broke protocol. Senenmut was a royal, considered a royal, not just a noble. And we know that Senenmut isn't a royal because he named his parents at one point. And it's on one of his tombs. And they have no titles at all. And it says that they were of humble origin. Now, we don't know anything about his parents, but we do know that if he named them as being of humble origin, this could very well mean of the common class, commoners, perhaps even servitude or slave class. And so he names them, and there's a sacred space, and to have Senenmut's tomb in such a place, sacred in itself, and at Hatshepsut's mortuary temple is where you find one of his tombs, that tomb that I visited, the tomb where I was, the tomb where I had that vision, that experience, and we talked about that. This was all in royal space. And this sacred space, to have Senenmut's tomb in such a place, sacred in and of itself, but also the personal space of the Pharaoh, shows a degree of closeness between the Pharaoh and Senenmut that's almost shocking on an historical level, unless there's an explanation for it. And the other tomb, TT 71, has decorations described by the Egyptologist Peter Dorman in the book Hatshepsut from Queen to Pharaoh. And it was clearly being done by artists from the royal ateliers. Doman also dismisses the suggestion that Senenmut may have been Hatshepsut's lover. He dismisses that. I disagree with him. In the tomb TT-71, a sarcophagus belonging to Senenmut was found. It's made of quartzite, a material only allowed to be used by royals in Egyptian history. And besides, we know that Moses neither dies nor is buried in Egypt. Senenmut is not buried in either of his tombs, but has totally disappeared from the Egyptian record. There's no record of his death. Is this something that Amenhotep II also eradicated? Besides the statues of Senenmut holding the infant princess, there are many statues made of him making offerings to the gods, and these statues were made to stand in the presence of the gods. And again, it's not permitted for a non-royal to enter the presence of the gods. Having your statue there was the equivalent of you being in the presence of the gods in person. And here again, Senenmut is treated as a royal. And all these statues are of a very young man, so it must be Hatshepsut who ordered these statues to be made. So to be in the presence of the gods was a very favored position, because you would receive the continual blessings of the gods. And there's a little bit more of this that we're not going to be able to cover before the end of this first half of the show. So we're going to come back and we're going to wrap up on Senenmut, but we're going to move into Joseph. We're going to talk about him a little bit. And I think this is astounding history, especially if you were raised in a Judeo-Christian or even a Muslim background. These are all characters that we are familiar with. And I think putting the flesh on the bones, opening up the crack of the door in the dark room of history and letting some light in, lends veracity to these characters. They become more than the bedrobe, bath-sheeted
Are you looking for a really awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff, and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAllenRoberts.com. That's Scott with 2 T's, ALANROBERTS.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad, so he can take me to Disneyland.
All right, folks, we're back. Thanks for sitting on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. Come on over and see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio by going to odysy1.com. And also come over and watch the video simulcast of this program over on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And while there, join the lively chat room of fellow Intrepids that's going on right now during this show. Come on and join us and have a good time over there. Now we're talking about Senenmut. We're talking about who he was in history. And we're talking about how the biblical history seems to coincide with who this character is in ancient Egypt. And again, his bust sitting right here over my shoulder, that bust of Senenmut, and that shows him with the young Neferuri, the princess. And I think it's important to look into the history of biblical characters. It's like, let me comment on this for a second, because this has been a thing that has rankled me and at the same time energized me. And that is this idea that I run into quite often, where people say, oh, that's just something out of the Bible. The Bible's just a bunch of fairy book story tales anyway. Storybook fairy tales. It's all false. It's all fictional. Well, I disagree with that. You may have a faith story in the Old Testament and the New Testament that you disagree with. Whether it's true or not, you've got the free will to accept or deny or reject the faith story that is in the Bible. However, the history around which these faith stories are wrapped is efficacious. There's veracity to them that has been found over and over and over again. This is why biblical archaeology exists, not necessarily to establish the faith story as being true theology, but to establish that the events in the Bible took place. And the theology was stuff that the writers of these individual 66 books put around those historical events, especially in the Old Testament. These are historical events with fantastical stories of faith wrapped into them, folded into them, blended into them. And I believe the story of Moses isn't as obscure or, what's the word I'm looking for? As, not obscure, but it's not as impossible to plug this into history as we think it might be. Just because there isn't evidence historically does not mean that there's not what we used to call secondary archaeological evidence that seems to indicate that the biblical account is there's veracity to it, and that there is truth to it. And so you start digging into these characters, you start digging into the dates and the timelines, and you end up finding out that these characters were real people. I believe Moses was Senenmut, the Grand Vizier underneath Hatshepsut. And because he disappeared off of the Egyptian record, this is one of the circumstantial bits of evidence that you can look at and say, well, Senenmut may be this guy, but that's just one of the bits. And there's all kinds of bits of circumstantial information that you can plug in. And so if Senenmut was indeed the Grand Vizier to Hatshepsut, and if she indeed was the woman who found him in the Nile when she was young, And by the way, let me say about that. I know I've stated this before, but I want to say it again tonight in context. There are people who said, oh, that's another storybook story. Moses in the basket floating down the Nile, and the princess finds him in the Nile and adopts him. Well, they say that, well, that's just a repeat of the story of Osiris, or the repeat of the story of whoever, these other fictional godlike characters in history. The thing is, just because it's the same type of an event doesn't mean it's a copycat or a fictionalized tale. Do you think for a moment, and this is my conjecture, that Moses' mother, who was by this time Israel, the Hebrews had been in Egypt for at least a couple of hundred years, and the Bible states 400 years. Well, if you add up all the time that they were in Egypt, even pre-captivity, you might get close to that number. It's a rounded figure. And so you've got the Hebrews, who are slaves of the Egyptians, many of them Egyptianized already. They are Hebrew by blood, Egyptian by activity, by heritage now. And so, do you think that she didn't know the stories of Osiris, the stories of these old god men floated down the Nile in baskets? Do you think that she wasn't playing into the Egyptian mythology when she puts Moses in a basket and places him? It doesn't say she floated him down the main expanse of the Nile. He'd have been eaten by crocodiles in moments. It says that she placed him amongst the reeds, placed the basket amongst the reeds. And this was where the palace was, and the princess had come there to bathe, probably in a pool that was made, an enclosed pool at the palace. She came there to bathe from water taken in off of the Nile, not the main channel, but probably one of the many networks of canals that were dug and filled off of the Nile. And there she saw the basket. So the basket was placed in the reeds next to the place where she bathed, by the palace, off the canal. And there she finds him. So I think Moses' mother knew exactly what she was doing when she did that. The mythology she was playing into, and the heartstrings she was pulling. She was gambling that the young princess was going to see him, and it would pull on her heart, which it did. So, moving away from that into Senenmut, going back again into who he was, there's a number of reliefs that were carved in the most sacred space of all, in the Deir el-Bahri temple of Jesher. That's the big picture I put up yesterday. That's this temple. If you remember, quite a neat picture, Deir el-Bahri, right here. So this temple was a temple that Senenmut built for Hatshepsut. And now I've been there several times. It's an amazing place, and the feelings there are palpable. But this is that temple, and what you've got is Senenmut has his tomb, which is right outside this temple, in the foreground. If you go, I pointed it out yesterday. If you look at this again, you see the temple there? Just go to the right of the temple and down a little bit to the right. You're going to see a little building with a flat roof on it. That's the coffee shop and the little tourist site where you can buy trinkets and things. And just more again to the right of that, you see what looks like pits going down. This is just like the gullies off of the raised processional road. And down in there is the tomb of Senenmut. This is where his tomb was. Now, just the fact that his tomb was there alone is something that would only have been accorded to a royal. So he's treated as a royal. And then his statues, all his statues, were something that would have been accorded to a royal. There's a number of reliefs carved in the most sacred spaces in all of Deir el-Bahri, in that temple, in the sanctuary of Amun itself. One is even carved in the back wall of the sanctuary, where the ceremonial boat which carried the idol of Amun, was placed overnight before its return journey to Waset. For the images of a common citizen to be placed in such a sacred space breaks every rule of Egyptian protocol in the book. But Hatshepsut must have been the one to do this, and done it because Senenmut was the son she had adopted, and she was ambitious for him to rise high in Egypt. Now, of course, people would say, well, I thought they were lovers too. Well, they were. Keep in mind, they married their own brothers and sisters back then as well to strengthen the line. She knew that Senenmut was not her blood, and probably a romantic draw between them. It's very evident that Senenmut loved her his entire life, and so she elevated him to Senenmut, brother, mother's brother. I was once your mother, and now you are my brother. She equates him to the gods, probably legitimizing, even at least in her own mind, the love between them. There's a number of reliefs that are carved that show his image everywhere, even in the temple itself. You looked at her funerary temple there of Jesher Jesheru, Diyar el Bahre. In the Holy of Holies there, her funerary temple, the doors were set on hinges, and those doors would open, and when they were open, you couldn't see what was on the walls behind them. Only when the doors were closed could you see what was on the walls, but those doors are closed and sealed. Nobody would see them. And inside that Holy of Holies, down near the floor, near the door jambs, on both sides, Senenmut had put his image, his name, his cartouche, talking about how he was the only beloved of the queen. That was inside some place where nobody would ever even see it. And that's why I believe they still existed. They survived being chiseled off by Amenhotep II. So during the course of his years at the court of Hatshepsut, Senenmut is acknowledged by experts in Egyptology to have held many of the highest titles in the land, showing that he truly was the greatest of the great in Hatshepsut's court. In our book, The Exodus Reality, John Ward and I had, in one of my chapters, I list all these titles of Senenmut. He had 92 royal titles given him by Hatshepsut, bestowed upon him. Senenmut's high standing in the court during the reign of Hatshepsut, coupled with him being wiped from the Egyptian historical record, that whole narrative, and the correlation between the biblical and the Egyptian dating systems would suggest, therefore, that he was the person we know from the Bible as Moses. Senenmut is Moses. So having discovered the story of Hatshepsut and Senenmut, we can look at this character and say he was a real person with real meat on the bones. And that's about all we have about Senenmut. There's more I could get into, more technical stuff about his reign. There are certainly Egyptologists that don't look at the biblical aspects at all. We had Karakuni, who wrote the book, and I've got it on one of my shelves over here somewhere. The Woman Who Would Be King, I think is the title. It's about Hatshepsut. And we asked her in the interview, and I said, well, what do you think of this whole theory? She acknowledges it definitely Hatshepsut and Senenmut were lovers. But when I asked her, what do you think about the notion that Senenmut is Moses? And she brushed me off in a heartbeat. Oh, basically, we don't have time to think about that stuff. Why? There's so much rich history. Why get into that speculative history? And she really brushed it off. And I think that's a boat she's missing. So let's leave this now. That's Senenmut. And we have talked about, I talked about at the very beginning, how I wanted to get into a little bit of this history of the Hyksos and Joseph. So we're talking about Moses and the Exodus, the Hechar magics. We're talking about how Moses would have been Senenmut, how he was the man that delivered his people from bondage in Egypt. But how did they get there in the first place? And when they first came, weren't they accepted as guests of the Pharaoh. The family clan of about 70 plus people of Jacob during a time of famine moved the family to Egypt and all their flocks and their whole family, about 70 people, down from Canaan, the Canaanite region. It was not Israel yet, but they moved from the Canaanite region. Israel was just the family name. They were the clan of Israel. Jacob, Israel, known as Israel. They moved to Egypt, to the fertile delta region, and they're given land, and there they dwell. Now, according to the history of Israel, it was the family that moved down under the permission of the Pharaoh, which was granted them by the Grand Vizier, which, according to the biblical story, was none other than Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob, and that he had been raised to great power in Egypt, and he is the one who grants them permission to stay and to join him in Egypt. And the story, though, is a rich story, and it reads like a tale. It's a historical tale. It's a legend. The question is there veracity? Like the story of Moses, is there historical veracity to the story of Joseph? Now, this morning, when I wanted to put this together for tonight, I didn't dig out a lot of stuff. I'm still going to do a little more research, so I'm going to give you the story from the seat of my pants, off the top of my head, what I know. And we'll dig in a little deeper tomorrow in the show. We've got right now, about 10, 12 minutes left of this show. And so, if I did my math right. So we're going to dig into this now a little bit, and let's see where we get going. Now, the first thing I want to tell you is that I believe that Joseph is raised to great power in Egypt under one of the Hyksos kings. And the Hyksos were, let's talk about the Hyksos for a minute. The Hyksos were a Semitic people who gained a foothold in Egypt around 1780s BCE at the city of Avaris. And they built the city of Avaris in Lower Egypt, which is, don't let this confuse you, Lower Egypt is northern Egypt, closer to the Mediterranean, the Nile Delta area. It's Lower Egypt because the Nile flows north into the Mediterranean. And so Lower Egypt, or Northern Egypt, they take power, and they initiated the era known as, in Egyptian history, as the Second Intermediate Period, which is 1782 through 1570 BCE. Again, the number is going backwards, just like the river going backwards, because it's BCE. And so what you've got now is you've got a people that are from the Canaanite region that took over the royal seat in northern Egypt. Now, this didn't happen overnight, and they held it, by the way, for about 108 years. They hold northern Egypt. Now, the real Egyptians, the blood Egyptians, are down in the south. Luxor, which is Thebes at the time, about 400 miles south of what is now Cairo, in the mouth of the Delta region of the Nile, up in the north. And they're all living down south, and the Hyksos have taken over the north. Now, there wasn't a battle. They didn't come in and wipe out Egyptians. What had happened was, for about 800 years, people from the Canaanite region, which is now Israel, it's up in that area that is today Israel, that whole region, you had people that would filter in and migrate south down into Egypt, because during either times of famine, where they needed to find good pastures to bring their flocks, and to grow their crops and so on, they would migrate down to Egypt, where there wasn't the dry area, the arid famine times. And so as they moved down in there, this happened over centuries and generations. People would move in. And the ancient scribes in Egypt referred to these people as coming from the Canaanite region, Syria, north of that, the Mesopotamian region, all these people that would filter down over all this time These 800 years, they were referred to as Asiatics. And so you find them written about, the Asiatics. And these people filtered into the Nile Delta region. The family of Israel, this family clan of about 70 people being not unique at all. Their coming to Egypt during a time of famine was not uncommon at all. Now, what it was, however, though, these people over centuries had so ingrained themselves into Egyptian culture, they became Egyptians because they settled in the towns and the villages there. And eventually they got involved, of course, in civic aspects of what was going on up there. And the Hyksos ended up being named so because they were part of this people group. They eventually went in. It's almost like having a voting bloc in the United States or in Great Britain or in all these people. They created a bloc and they infiltrated government. And it wasn't spies. It wasn't nastiness. There was no bloodshed unless there were individual cases. But what they did was they just moved in and they took over the government. And then they established their own monarchy in the north of Egypt, which split Egypt into two, Lower and Upper Egypt. Upper being in the south, lower being in the north. And the Hyksos held this for about 108 years. They had their own pharaoh at the time, their own pharaohs at the time, over this 108-year period, while the Egyptians had their pharaohs in the south. Now, there's something very telling, and we've talked about this before in past shows, but in establishing Joseph, why would the pharaohs, even in the north, accept Joseph or raise him to great power? Well, in a simple answer, it's because they were cousins, so to speak. The Hyksos were Canaanite peoples. Joseph was a Canaanite, and he was elevated to power. He was one of them. The Egyptians referred to the Canaanites, the Hyksos, as, the Hyksos comes from the term talking about shepherding kings. The kings are the peoples who are from the shepherding lands and tribes. And so this is how they looked at them, and they hated them. There's a verse in the Old Testament that says the Egyptians hate shepherds. Why did they hate them? At the time of the context of that phrase being written about, it's because the shepherding peoples had taken over northern Egypt. And so Joseph, I believe, was accepted and raised to power because of his heritage, where he came from. He was a Hyksos. He was a shepherding people. He was a Canaanite. And so this is why he's raised to power. But let's go back and ask the question, why is Joseph even there in the first place? I'm going to call up, let's see if do I have it up here already or not? No. I want to look at the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. Let's see what we get here. Joseph, his dreams and so on. Let's take a look at this. In Genesis chapter 37, it says this: Joseph lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob, his father. This is his line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, Israel being Jacob, that was his other name, because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him, and they couldn't speak a kind word to him. So Joseph is now the favorite son of his elderly father because he's the son of his father's old age, and his father treats him extra special. Now, Joseph had it, and he makes him, by the way, this fabulous, colorful coat. And these colorful coats were really coats of think of burnt red, burnt oranges, burnt tans and browns. When you had these striped coats, it was a coat of honor. It wasn't colorful like wow, rainbow. the play, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Now, it was a coat of the colors of the day, but it was multiple in that it was striped, and he was given this garment by his father. It was a garment of high honor. Now, Joseph at this time had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. And he said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose up and stood upright, while all of your sheaves," he's speaking to his other brothers, "gathered around mine and bowed down to it." Now imagine, he's the favorite son. He's the youngest and the favorite son, and he's telling this to his older brothers. We're like, piss off, Joseph. His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us or something? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and what he had said. Not just that their father, that Joseph was their favorite, and he's the kid, and he's the snot-nosed kid, and he's getting the special coat of honor, and his father treated him with special honor, but then now he's saying, "I'm having dreams, and you're all bowing to me." And then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he says, "listen to this other dream I had. And this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." And when he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. And he thought about this. And so Joseph is not doing himself any favors to have everybody like him in the family. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you over to them." Joseph replied, "Okay." And so he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off to the valley of Hebron. Now when Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" And he replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are, grazing their flocks?" I'm sure there's a little more detail than that. He said, "They moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached him, his own brothers plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. Now, this is probably not verbatim. This is the story as we're told. You can imagine the conversation. "Come, now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." So when Reuben heard this, one of the brothers, he tried to rescue Joseph from their hands. No, we don't kill our flesh and blood. He's saying, let's not take his life. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. And Reuben said this to rescue Joseph from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe. They beat the shit out of him. The ornate robe he was wearing was taken off. They took him and threw him into the cistern. And the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. And as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. We'll talk about the Ishmaelites. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh. They were on their way to take him down to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our own brother and cover up his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a single finger on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And all the brothers agreed. So let's not kill him. Let's just sell our own flesh and blood into slavery. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brother pulled Joseph up out of the cistern, sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him into Egypt. And when Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph wasn't there, he tore his clothes. It was a traditional lament. And he went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in the blood, and they took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine to see whether it's your son's robe. You know, that really nice one you gave him?" And he recognized it and said, "It's my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his own clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and mourned for his son for many days. And all his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. And meanwhile the Midianites sold Joseph to Egypt, to a man named Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. And we're going to leave that there for tonight. We're out of time. We're going to pick this story up of Joseph and look into Egyptian history